Today we're going to dig into the details behind natural selection and adaptations in populations. We have a couple learning goals. First, we need to define natural selection. Next, we need to be able to describe the 4 steps of natural selection, giving an example at each step, explaining the importance of variation in a community, and knowing how populations and species respond to environmental changes. So natural selection means that organisms that are the best adapted to an environment survive and reproduce more than others. This means that they are more fit, therefore the environment selects for their survival. Organisms that have adaptations are most likely going to be selected in the environment. Adaptations, remember, are inherited traits that increase an organism's chances of survival. This could be related to behavior or related to physical appearance or even related to physiological traits. Regardless, we have 4 steps that govern how natural selection works on populations in the environment. This includes number 1, overproduction, going back to Thomas Malthus's essay on populations. Number 2, variation or variability in genotypes that is brought through to the physical level into phenotypes. Number 3, competition, both between populations and across populations. And then finally, selection. Taking a look at these 2 organisms, we have the hedgehog on the right and the Arctic fox on the left. Just ask yourself, what types of adaptations do you see? Might be related to size, might be related to the texture of their coat, could be related to the color of their coat. And in order to understand why these organisms look this way, it's important to remember that there's environmental pressures that select for these appearances. Number 1, overproduction. This simply means that each species produces more offspring that can theoretically survive in the environment. If you remember a couple of lectures ago, we talked about Thomas Malthus and his influence on Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And the idea is that in order to hedge your bets for survival, it makes sense to make more babies than can actually survive in the environment. We can see this when we have rabbits, for example, that produce lots and lots of babies. We can also see this in frogs. And if you have ever seen a whole bunch of frogs be spawned at one time, it could be in the hundreds in a tiny, tiny little pool that all begin to develop and mature, and invariably there's not going to be enough resources for all of them to survive, and some of them will be plucked off by predators. So number 1 is overproduction. Number 2 is variation. This means that each individual has a unique combination of inherited traits from their parents. And this can manifest in different ways. Here we just have an example of different ladybugs with different numbers of spots on their back. Why not? But this is all driven from differences in allele frequency or gene frequency at the individual and the population level. We're going to be talking about the importance behind allele frequencies in populations and what that means for speciation in coming lectures. Let's delve into the importance behind variation. And variation is important simply because the environment changes all of the time. And the more variation that is found within a species, the more likely that species will survive. And the idea here is that if everyone was the same, then everyone is equally as vulnerable to environmental changes or diseases. And therefore, if they all have the same vulnerabilities, they're all going to be wiped out equally. So the more variation of types of a species in a habitat, the more likely at least some will survive. And an example is the replacement of dinosaurs by mammals in geologic time after the Cretaceous mass extinction event. So we can ask ourselves, which community, community A or community B, has a better chance of surviving a natural disaster? This goes back to an idea called species richness. How many different forms of life do you have in a community? The idea is that the more different life forms you have, the more robust or resilient the community is because there's more variation. So community A, we have a butterfly, a bear, a rodent, a beaver, a peacock, a snake, and an owl, as well as some grasses and bushes and trees. Community A seems to have a pretty high amount of species richness. Let's look at community B. We only have the bear and the rodent. All of our other little friends scampered away somewhere. So if this were to be subjected to a natural disaster, the likelihood that community A would bounce back is much higher than community B, simply because there's much more variation in community A compared to community B. Number 3, acting in natural selection, is competition. As we know, individuals compete for limited resources. This could be related to food, water, or shelter, or even mates. Natural selection occurs through, quote, survival of the fittest. And just to review, when we say fittest, we mean something that has fitness or the ability to survive and reproduce. And with that being the definition, it goes along with that not all individuals are going to survive to adulthood when they could have the chance to reproduce. So you are considered a fit individual if you are able to survive through adulthood and have your own offspring. And number 4, the final step in natural selection, is the selection part. The individuals with the best traits or the best adaptations will survive and have the opportunity to pass their traits off to offspring. Natural selection acts on the phenotype, so the physical appearance of the organism, and not the underlying genotype or the genetic makeup. But the genotype inherently makes up the phenotype, so they are inextricably linked. But the predator, for example, when it finds its prey, it's not seeking out the prey because the prey has a specific set of genes. It's seeking out the prey because of physical characteristics that it's able to see, like, well, this rabbit over here is much slower, so I'm going to eat that one, or this rabbit's much easier to see because it has a brighter fur coat, for example. So when a predator finds its prey, it's seeking out the physical appearance, not the underlying genotype, even though natural selection will invariably affect both. Individuals with traits that are not well suited to their environment either are going to die off or leave very few offspring behind, such that their population becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And evolution occurs when good traits build up inside of a population over many generations, and bad traits are eliminated by the death of the individuals. And therefore, them dying, they can't leave any offspring behind to leave behind traits. Let's connect the two ideas, natural selection and adaptation. Natural selection, you have to understand, is not random. It occurs in response to environmental changes, and it results in adaptations by advantageous traits being passed on. Mutations are the random part in this entire story. So I like to say that natural selection is the non-random selection of random mutations. Through recombination and sexual reproduction, you will have different emergence of random mutations in a population, and the environment will then select basically which of those mutations are advantageous. And natural selection is going to keep around those advantageous traits. What do we mean by adaptation? Okay, we talked about what it is in the abstract, but in specific detail, adaptations are changes in structure or behavior of populations to become more suited to an environment through natural selection. We can talk about structural adaptations, and this is a trait in an organism's body that helps it to survive in its environment. So this is a purely physical type of adaptation. This could be things like camouflage in an organism, their fur color or coat. This could be specialized structures. So if you have an appendage that makes you look like a twig, for example, if you're a stick bug. This could be body parts. Here's some specific examples of structural adaptations. Some of these structural adaptations can reduce competition for resources, which is pretty interesting. It's not just related to being able to evade predation. Some examples include giraffes that are eating from taller trees instead of shorter trees where all of the other animals might graze. So it's able to fill a different ecological niche in having that longer neck. It allows it access to a different food resource, therefore reducing competition. Zebras eat from the top part of grasses. Wildebeests eat leaves, and gazelles eat the rest of what's left. So here we have a partitioning of different food resources among different populations of organisms. And therefore, these structural adaptations to what these organisms can reach reduces the competition for resources. Here we have examples of camouflage. And camouflage helps protect from predators, but also from prey. We have the great potos that are birds, and they hide from predators in trees. We also have bush crickets that also hide from their predators in leaves. But we have this sneaky lion that's able to hide in the grasslands, blending right in and camouflage itself from its prey so it could sneak up and go in for the kill. These are really interesting structural adaptations. So some body parts allow for protection against predators. They allow protection to make them harder to eat. Armadillos, like this one here, have armor that allow them to roll up into a ball, making them a not so easy snack for whatever would want to eat it. Here we have pufferfish that are really spiky and poisonous. And not to mention, they blow up so big that it's probably difficult to fit a pufferfish inside of your mouth. And then finally, we have bees with these little stingers that protect not only them, but also their hive. In addition to the structural adaptations that we just talked about, we also have behavioral adaptations. These are actions that an organism takes to help it survive in an environment. This is stuff like group behavior, migration, hibernation, etc. There are different types of behaviors. First, we have something called innate behavior. This is something that is inborn within an individual. This is a behavior that an organism is born with. It is inherited. In contrast, we have something called learned behavior. This is a behavior that an organism acquires throughout its lived experience, through teaching from its parents or siblings, as well as practice and play with its siblings and other members of the community. There are a number of benefits to group behavior. Number one, protection from predators. You're less likely to be picked off if you are herded up in a group. You can protect the most vulnerable by placing those vulnerable members, maybe they're babies or maybe they're older, you can place them into the center of the group. Number two, hunting packs. That's a type of group behavior, and this makes hunting more efficient. It allows you to stalk your prey, form a strategy and enclose them. It makes you more efficient in capturing your prey That way, if all of the group members participate, you're more guaranteed to succeed in the killing of that prey. And number 3, reproductive efficiency. If you are surrounded by mates all the time, you're more likely to find a mate to reproduce with, and you can care for your young together. So group behavior allows for reproductive efficiency, not only in finding a mate to reproduce with, but also to care for that young together. An example of a group behavior that we probably see all the time if we look up is flocking. Flocking is exemplified by birds, and I'm unsure what this is an image of, but I've definitely seen in Knoxville lots of flocking behavior in blackbirds. Migration is also another group behavior, moving en masse to another location, either seasonally or yearly. Herding is a group behavior. There are different types of herds, and again, it all traces back to protection, most likely of the youngest members in the population. Schooling is just a herd of fish, basically, moving en masse, again, as a form of protection. The idea is that if you all group together, you're less likely to be the one individual chosen to be eaten. It's a density problem. Cooperative hunting, here we have hyenas going in for a kill. They all get to share in the kill because they all put in a little bit of work. Let's talk about environmental changes and natural selection. As we know, the environment is always changing in a myriad of ways, and organisms that are able to adapt to environmental change will survive and reproduce. And sometimes populations have to shift or change due to any number of environmental changes or disturbances. And we're going to talk about a couple of those. We have 3 population responses to environmental change. They're nested within 2 higher levels. We have gradual change and we have sudden change. Under gradual change, we can talk about population shifts, which is an increase in the amount of individuals with favorable traits. And as we have in recent lectures, talk about speciation, the emergence of a new species through new specialized adaptations. And finally, we can chalk it up to sudden change with death in an area or an entire extinction event if those populations were not able to adapt rapidly enough. Response number 1, gradual population shift. So population evolution, or the increase in those with a favorable trait, is the first route for adaptation to environmental change. Population overall is going to have a greater chance of survival if it's able to shift in one direction. This population shift is going to form distinct populations, those that may look different from each other, they may behave in different ways. Some examples of this include the peppered moth, which we'll talk about on the next slide, but also bacterial resistance to antibiotics. And here we have the MRSA, the methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which once it gets hold in a hospital environment, for example, it's very, very hard to get rid of because it is resistant to modern antibiotics, because we have, using antibiotics, induced this population shift. Adaptations to our antibiotics have accrued so much, the populations of Staphylococcus aureus and other virulent microorganisms have developed a resistance. So here's the example of the peppered moth. We have to put its ecology in context. Here we have Say's phoebe. This is the predator for the peppered moth. So which moth will the bird catch? If it's sitting on a white backdrop, the Say's phoebe is most likely going to catch this dark colored moth because it's much harder to see this camouflaged white peppered moth. But if we began to change the background environment or the bark color of the trees, for example, we have to ask what would happen to the population of moths. Well, if we change that background color from white to a dark color, now the white moth is going to be the one that's preyed upon the most because it's not camouflaged any longer. It's the darker colored peppered moth that now is effectively camouflaged. So this would lead to a population shift where in areas where we have light colored bark, the white peppered moth would be selected for in the environment. And where we have dark colored bark, the dark colored peppered moth is going to be selected for in the environment. This is an example of clinal variation, and we'll get to talk about this specific example in detail in another lecture as well. The second type of gradual response is speciation. And we've already gotten to talk about speciation in previous lectures. We're going to talk about different types or mechanisms of speciation next week. And finally, response number 3 is the sudden response. And the sudden response often is just extinction and death. And that's because there's no time to adapt. This leads to the death of the species in that area or a massive extinction event, not only affecting that species, but several around it in the community. And the best example of this is the woolly mammoth after the Ice Age. We saw a rapid shift in our climate. The woolly mammoth was not able to adapt rapidly enough, and therefore it went extinct. And now with thawing permafrost, we're actually exhuming many more examples of these fossilized, preserved woolly mammoths. There are 3 types of natural selection, and they all can be explained in this histogram sort of way. So on the x-axis here, we have different phenotypes. The phenotype that we'll be talking about here in our example to describe the 3 types of natural selection is going to be fur color, with white mice over here on the left getting darker and darker in color up until we get this dark brown mouse on the right. So suppose a certain mouse population has a range of fur colors from nearly white to a dark brown. The frequency of the individuals is here on the y-axis, and this is the frequency for the different colors. It's a normal distribution, meaning it has this bell curve shape. Most of the organisms in the population have this medium brown fur color. The first type of natural selection is called directional selection. So, in this example, the surrounding woody environment may provide a better camouflage for darker mice. Thus, most of the lighter colored mice may be easily hunted. So in this scenario, this is our original population. We have the original population now here in the dashed line. And because it's easier for darker mice to survive in the environment, we have the natural selection pushing in this direction towards a darker fur color. So our evolved population, after natural selection has exerted its pressure, we have shifted the frequency of the different mouse fur color distributions, and we no longer even have those lighter mice represented in our population. We have this directional selection moving our bell curve from the left to the right. The second type of natural selection is called stabilizing selection. Now we have a different scenario, same mice. In this scenario, a new predator may only be able to see vivid colors like the really white color and dark brown. This allows the dull brown mouse to avoid detection and escape predation. So if we're taking a look, comparing our original population, where we had the broad spectrum of fur colors represented, those have all gone away. And now we have squeezed in the middle here and stabilized the population to be housing only one type of fur color, this dull brown mouse. We've gotten rid of the extremes on both sides, and we have stabilized strongly in the middle. The third type of natural selection is disruptive selection. In this example, we have the same mice, our original population here in the dashed line, but in this scenario, predators may not eat the vividly colored mice in the area because other white and dark brown creatures in the area are toxic. And so the predators want to avoid the white and dark brown mice. So what does this do? This selects for the white and the dark brown mice because they're not being eaten by the predator. So what this does is it shifts our frequency distribution to this bimodal distribution, where we have a greater frequency of the white, we really don't have many of the in-betweens, and we have a high frequency of the dark colors.